Thank you, everybody, and thanks for those online who've stuck with us through all these presentations. If you're still here, thanks for staying here. So yes, we are new to the field of research. We are practitioners at heart, but we've noticed when it comes to evangelism or sharing our faith, there's a real gap that we see in what the research has been pointing to for a couple decades now, and kind of what's being developed and delivered on the ground. We want to talk about something, just to give you an outline of where we're going in the next few minutes here. We want to talk about something that we are calling the relevancy barrier to the gospel, and you've felt it before. You've bumped up against it when you've tried to share your faith. You probably haven't called it the relevancy barrier because we kind of made that up, but you felt it. So we just want to give some background, some support for it through our own experience in local youth work, through students that we've led on a placement-based degree, through scripture, and then through what the missional thought leaders are writing about and talking about. So we thought we might share just a little bit of our story of how we got here. We moved to Bicester, Oxfordshire in 2003. We joined a local church and started working in the schools, working in the community, gathering young people. And we had a friend who's a vicar who pointed us towards the Fresh Expressions model of planting church. And we really resonated with it. It ticked a lot of boxes. It talks about how can you listen to God, but also listen to your community and the needs in the community. So we sent young people out to find out, what do young people in our town of Bicester need? And how can we meet that need? And then as you serve those needs in love, you build relationship, create community, share faith, create a church. Bam, easy as that, right? So we followed that model and through a drop-in in Costa, worked through that model. We also trained it with our students, so we've been helping lead a placement-based degree in theology and mission through Rain Ministries, and we use the Fresh Expressions model in our own experiences to train our students. And you know what we discovered? We discovered that collectively, we were really good at building relationships with young people. I think our students were really creative. I think the church is really creative at getting out there and building relationships. But we found out when it came to trying to help young people engage in matters of faith, kind of taking that social capital, the relationships we built, and turning that into spiritual capital, we just felt really stuck. And I think what we found is that the young people we were working with were not really asking questions about faith. They weren't against it. They were happy that we had faith. They were happy that it helped us. They were just simply indifferent. And it felt like a lot of the resources and a lot of the help that was out there just was aiming at the wrong starting point. It was aiming at, hey, let's get together and talk about Jesus and answer your questions about Christianity. And our young people were like, okay, whatever. And for us, it seemed like, this might be a controversial statement, but to us, it felt like the gospel didn't sound like good news to young people who were not looking for God. So we felt stuck.
Yeah. All right, so this barrier that we would come up against, we're starting to call it the relevancy barrier, and it's the one that sounds like, I'm glad you have faith, but I really can't be bothered. Or it sounds like, it's all right that you have faith. I'm glad you're happy. I think I'm happy without God. Okay, it's an indifference barrier. We're calling the relevancy barrier, and we could go into lots of details about the reasons the indifference barrier is so prevalent. But I think most of us in this room and online are quite aware of the factors that have led up to where we are currently at. But we'll look at just a few real quickly. The latest census tells us that 70% of young people between the ages of 16 and 29 now are identifying completely as non-religious in any way. So this is being referred to, of course, as the nuns out there. When you extract that to the adult population as a whole, it's 29 million people across the UK. I have no religious affiliation. And so we started to talk with anyone that would listen. because we were finding there was just no residue of the Jesus story left. And the young people we worked with were multiple generations removed from God and the church. So we read a lot. We talked to other youth workers and practitioners. We read books about people who went to completely unreached groups of people, and that helped form our thinking. We turned to people who are much more clever than us, missional thought leaders, apologists, theologians. What were they writing about? And we found that we were not the only ones facing this relevancy barrier. So I'd refer you to Youthscape's piece of research a few years back that they ended up calling No Questions Asked. Because Chris Curtis tells this story of they were gathering this group of young people to let them ask their questions about Christianity. And as they were doing this, they found out this group of people, young people, had no questions. They did not know any questions to ask about Christianity, about Jesus, about the Bible. And so it was almost like, well, what are we going to talk about? Okay? Or YFC, also more recent study talks about how this generation is neutral on matters of faith. And they said it's not really hostility that we come up against so much. It's rather indifference. So yeah, we began to wonder, is it possible to stir curiosity?
Yeah. So yeah, is it possible to help people get on the path to faith? And could we maybe create a tool or a resource that started where people are starts where they're starting? And it felt like we needed to understand the questions that people were asking. That's a great place to start, right? If they're not asking these kinds of questions, what questions are they asking? And through our own reading, again, with the missional thought leaders, through our own local youth work and talking with our students, it became really evident that the types of questions people are asking today aren't the truth questions. And that's kind of where we started early days of youth work. We want to show you that the Bible is credible and God is real and Jesus really existed and rose from the dead. But those really aren't the kinds of questions that people are starting by asking today. Instead, the kinds of questions they're asking are more the relevance questions. Not truth, but not does God exist, but why would it matter? And how could God help my life? What difference would it make to have faith? We were also really aware that the way people decide what is true when it comes to matters of faith and belief isn't through presenting information or propositional truth claims. And in logic, we weren't going to logic any of the young people in that photo we showed. We weren't going to logic them into faith. Instead, people decide what's true by their own personal experience. And, that was quite a challenge. It's like, okay, we have a generation who has no history with God or God's story or the church, and somehow we have to help them experience their way into faith. So that felt like a big challenge.
So we also wondered if we could look to Scripture. Of course, we want our practice to flow out of our theology. And so we wondered if we could find any examples in Scripture for engaging people who are simply indifferent. And we learned a lot from looking at Paul's example as he shifted his starting point and his methodology, and he went from being in the synagogues and preaching to the Jews out on to more engaging with the Gentiles out in the public spaces and the public spheres. And we learned a lot from him, especially around Acts 17. And a couple of the principles quickly that we learned. We see that Paul started where people were starting as he entered the public sphere. He searched for clues that God has placed in the cosmos, and he pointed them out to the people. He found common ground with the culture. And then he did what he knew would work in that culture to stir curiosity. Acts 17, Paul says to the people listening in the Areopagus, "In him we live and move and have our being." And that was his starting point. Much different starting point than when he was in the synagogue or other places. And so we can learn and draw from that.
Yeah, loads we can learn. If we had more time, we could unpack it. But loads we can learn from Paul's approach. But there's still a difference between his context and ours, because Paul's audience believed in loads of gods. And in our context, the young people we worked with, my neighbor, our coworkers, it seems like they're almost inoculated against any sense of belief in the supernatural or spiritual beliefs. But we've learned to kind of bank on the fact or rely on the fact, even though it might be buried underneath a thick layer of cultural dust, as Chris Curtis from Youthscape says, we can bank on the fact that every human being is a spiritual being. And not just that every human has a soul, but as humans, we are a soul. And so our task as we engage in mission to those outside the church and build relationships is to uncover and call attention to those longings that reveal the presence of our soul. So look for those longings that reveal our true spiritual nature, and we can start by stirring. You're seeing a pattern here. Start by stirring curiosity. And thankfully, we're not the only ones to talk about this. We're not these strange people with some strange ideas coming to you today. Loads of other people have been talking about this, and actually for a couple decades. So Frost and Hirsch, in their book Shaping Up Things to Come, talk about whispering to souls. That's kind of based on this horse whisper that there was a film made about several years ago. Alistair McGrath, we continue to learn tons from what he wrote all the way back in the 90s up till today. He talks about finding points of contact with the people around us. Tom Wright, Echoes of a Voice, he talks about there's echoes of a voice that can serve as a divine foothold to help bring people into conversations of faith. And then more recently, we'd really recommend to you, Daniel Strange has a new book out called Making Faith Magnetic, and he talks about 5 magnetic points that are almost this innate itch that people around us have that we can scratch and point out the true nature of our spiritualness, of our soul.
Great, good. All right, so our practice of stirring souls over the years with young people, we've uncovered some very practical stirring points. And I would love to be able to go through all of them, but that's not what we have time to do today. But I'll go through some of the ones the main stirring points that we have these stirring conversations around. The first one I think that'll come up is origins. The wonder, is there someone or something bigger out there? Suffering and injustice. I'm going to need to look here. The next one is prayer. We stir around prayer a lot. The afterlife, superstition, worship, and the sense of awe and wonder. So those are some of the main stirring points we use, but let me just unpack really quickly a couple of those. So we stir or have stirring conversations with people who are indifferent around suffering and injustice all the time. So despite the fact that we are taught that we owe our existence to random chance and survival of the fittest, we still expect the world to be good. And we are surprised and frustrated when it's not. All humans are surprised and frustrated when it's not. We expect people to be kind, not to get away with hurting others without consequences. C.S. Lewis refers to this as the law of decent behavior that's written in all of us. The strong should not be able to dominate the weak. Okay? And so we have lots of conversations with people who are fiercely unreligious and indifferent, but they care deeply about issues of justice. And when we're talking about the passion that they have, we often say, where do you think, we'll say something like, I see that you long for the world to be good and for people to be kind. Where do you think that longing comes from? Another stirring place is prayer. We have a lot of conversations. Darren has a lot of conversations when he's out walking our dog with people about prayer. People who will say to him, you're religious, right? and then they'll tell us they're not. But then they're dropping hints that they have something that they need help from outside of themselves with, and that they want us to pray about it. And so, of course, we do that. Sometimes we do that right there with them. But with prayer, everyone you meet has tried to pray. Or maybe when they were a young person, they tried to pray. And so we just ask, why is it, do you think, that humans look outside of themselves for help from something bigger? And we're trying to stir up, what is that longing in us to look outside of ourselves for help. The last one, do I have time to do one more? Yeah, a sense of awe and wonder, okay? When we are on a mountaintop or standing under a beautiful piece of art, we all experience from time to time a sense of inescapable meaning. Now, if we are just the result of blind forces, when we sense love or beauty or wonder, that's just the hardwiring in our brain responding to data. Love and beauty, and actually good and evil, are just illusions in our neurochemistry. But in the presence of great art or beauty, our souls tell us something different. Our souls feel delight and connection and satisfaction. And so when we're on a walk with a young person and they are telling us they have that feeling, or when we're in different situations, we can stir around this sense of awe and wonder. We long for more. We have this unfillable longing for satisfaction. And as soon as it comes and we experience it briefly, it also then goes. And so we can stir around that. What is that longing for connection, for satisfaction with something bigger than ourselves? We just ask people that kind of question all the time. So how can we then call attention to these longings? So stirring sounds like, these are some phrases that we say a lot. I think these longings cannot be explained by our body and our brain alone. Where do you think those longings come from? Or where does that question or that desire in you come from? So we're trying to point out the spiritual in them. We're trying to point out the soul. Another one. I think that shows you have a desire to connect with someone or something bigger than yourself. Or we might be in a situation where we can quite plainly say, I think that's your soul in action. You should keep praying. Someone tells us they tried praying, keep trying. We think that's your soul in action. You have a desire to connect with someone bigger than yourself. Keep doing it. And then how can we leverage this or use this to help people then go down a path of exploring Christian faith explicitly, right? Because that's what we want to do. So we often say something like, I believe that someone or something that you long for is God. Can I introduce you to him? Okay. What we're talking about falls firmly in pre-evangelism or the cultivating stages of evangelism. Go ahead, Darren.
Yeah. So stirring is just the beginning, but it's important because it provides that motivation in a society that's just indifferent to faith. So it kind of helps to crumble that relevancy barrier, but it is just the beginning. But it's no use to stir a soul if it doesn't lead to an opportunity for them to meet the lover of their soul, right? So we're trying to kind of make something sticky. We're trying to put a framework or a model together without it becoming an equation or it's easy 1, 2, 3, but we're trying to propose something that's sticky and kind of a stir approach where we start by stirring, bubbling up those longing of the soul, calling attention to them, and then translating that, so translating those longings as spiritual, as coming from our soul. Then, as Joy said, we want to introduce people to God. We want to then help them encounter Jesus, encounter the person of Jesus, and fall in love with the person of Jesus and be attracted to his way of life and see how, his relationship with the Father totally answered all those practical questions they have about, does it work? Does it make my life better? Does it make my relationships better? And then we want to find opportunities to invite them to respond to what's going on in their spirit and soul and what God's doing in their life. We've said all along in the last 15 minutes, and whoever will listen to us, we're not the first ones to talk about this. I really do feel like the research has been pointing this way for a couple decades. And again, we're not the clever initial researchers. We're kind of the collators of research and practitioners. But we are trying to pioneer a new way because we just feel like not enough has changed on the ground in the courses that we use at churches and the tools that we use, and then the conversations that everyday Christians find themselves in, it still feels like we tend to start with Jesus and then get stuck when people aren't interested. So we're piloting a new tool called the STIR course. We kind of call it a pre-evangelism course, and we really do feel like it tries to do the job of bubbling up those spiritual longings, calling attention to them, and then asking, hey, do you think that you are a spiritual being? And if you are, it's like, okay, well, we believe, you don't believe this yet, but we believe that you long to connect with God, and we would love to introduce him to you. And so then it goes into connecting with God. And then if you want to know God, Jesus is really important. We want you to meet Jesus, and then we want to give you an invitation to respond. So yeah, that's our new kind of pilot resource to try to help leaders do this, try to help churches do this. We are starting to measure impact and assess it. So we know of 30 or 40 groups that are using the STIR course across the country right now in churches and youth organizations. And we're having conversations with these leaders to follow up, to ask how it's going, to ask if it's helping them get unstuck. And then, yeah, to take surveys and ask them to complete. When your young people started this, would they define themselves as spiritual? And then at the end of the first phase, would they now say that they're spiritual? Have any light bulbs gone on? Is there any motivation now that there wasn't before?
Great. So we'd love for you to check it out. We have a few things, on Instagram. We're trying to talk about this space of the relevancy barrier and how do you stir up curiosity. On our website, we have the Beginner's Guide to Stirring Souls. So that really is some reading you could do to unpack this 20-minute presentation a bit further. And we're working right now on a Start to Stir video training series for churches that they can run in a small group or in a home group and start to train people. What questions are people really asking in this culture? And how can you stimulate spiritual curiosity in your everyday questions? And that's the project we're working on right now.
Great. So yeah, as we're researching this relevancy barrier, as we're trying to pilot some new approaches and some new tools, there are questions that we're asking ourselves, others are asking. I might be trying to prime you for these are the questions we want you to ask during the question and answer time because we already have thoughts. No, you don't have to stick to these questions. But yeah, I think some of the challenges or some of the, not pushback, I think pushback is too harsh, but it takes patience. Starting way back here takes patience. And I'm not sure as Christians and as the church we're ready to be that patient because it doesn't always feel successful, going back to Alice. What we want to measure, it's hard to measure and it takes a long time to measure. I think also just the reality is there's great courses out on the market that are usable. We use them, we help our church use them in the right time and right place, but I think it's difficult for church leaders, especially youth leaders, to use something new that I haven't used before. I don't have time to learn something new. I think defining what we mean by spiritual, because I think that can lead down a lot of potentially dangerous pathways, but I think it can also be leveraged to go down a really good, useful pathway. But I don't think the average person around us knows what that word means. And so we have to define it for them. And I think Christians are a little unsure about that word in general. So at any rate, whether in the church or out of church, I think we need to define that word. And I don't know if we always get to be in the room to define it before people decide what they think about that as a starting point. And then, yeah, I still think this takes some cultural awareness. It takes some understanding, being able to put ourselves in the shoes of the people around us and start where they're starting. And I think sometimes it just feels overwhelming. It's like, oh, I don't really understand all that. Can't I just talk about Jesus? And yes, we want to talk about Jesus, but if people don't have a context for it, then I think that's where we get stuck. And then we just kind of give up on trying to share our faith. So, but I still think there is that natural, let's just talk about Jesus and hope it works. So yeah, thank you for listening. Thanks for working with us through some of the questions. And I think we'll take some time for question and answer after a pause, but we'll pass it over.